Hello friends, Navinan on No Limit Hold'em with another installment of Get Better Faster. We're going to be talking about exploitative iterations. And I don't think there is a consensus term for this, but what I'm trying to describe is the situation where, especially in a heads-up battle, where hero notices that villain is some distance away from Nash equilibrium. Maybe he's, I don't know, 3 whatever units, game space units. He's 3 game space units away from Nash equilibrium. If hero catches on to this, he can adjust in order to exploit his opponent, but he's only able to adjust in order to exploit by leaving himself open to being counter-exploited. So if your opponent is, say, 3 game space units away from Nash, you could move closer, like you could just move 2 game space units away, but you're still going to have to be some distance away from Nash equilibrium or unexploitable strategy in order to adjust to make more money from your opponent's mistakes than you would if you were just playing a Nash strategy. So if villain picks up on the fact that you are adjusting or that hero is adjusting, then he can exploit hero at least to the degree to which he's being exploited at that iteration. So that's what I mean when I say iteration, or hopefully that helps to illustrate what I mean by iteration. If hero then catches on to the fact that villain has adjusted, he can change his strategy to exploit that adjustment. And if we notice, we're hero, if we notice that villain is 4 game space units away from Nash, then we can move to 3, and we can adjust by quite a bit and really get a lot of extra value that we wouldn't get, a lot of extra EV that we wouldn't get by playing a more balanced equilibrium-like strategy. But then there's nothing that stops our opponent from coming in and counter-exploiting us. Maybe he moves to 2, and then we can move to 1. And if this keeps going back and forth, where each player is adjusting in order to exploit their opponent, but they're in each iteration, they're getting closer and closer to equilibrium, then at some point a stable equilibrium will occur. Where, I mean, this is kind of one way that you could go about trying to figure out what a Nash equilibrium might look like for any given game. Toy game, real poker scenario, name it. Like if if one player is over bluffing, then the other player should be calling with all their bluff catchers. If that player starts calling with all their bluff catchers, then their opponent in the next iteration can stop bluffing so much. Maybe they'll get closer to equilibrium, and this can go, so on and so forth until we actually reach a Nash equilibrium. So the goals of the video are to help everybody that's watching gain some kind of intuition about what game theory kind of looks like, or what it feels like, what it is, and how it relates to No Limit Hold'em, and also to provide some strategic ideas that you can actually just watch and apply right now. So we're going to be dealing with this villain that we're going to name Alpha. So villain A, or villain Alpha, raises 100% of his hands. We're in a heads-up match, and Alpha, villain A, folds all but the top 10% of hands facing a 3-bet. Villain A never calls, but will always 4-bet or fold when facing a 3-bet. So in this scenario, what can hero do to defeat villain A, or villain Alpha? The first one that we're talking about, so he's going to be Alpha. So because villain Alpha is doing all of these things, what can hero do to exploit him? Well, since villain A raises too many hands, we should fold less often. That's the first thing, and really that's the only thing we can conclude by knowing that he raises too many hands. If we know that he opens too many hands, if that's the only information we have, the only thing we know for sure is that we should fold less often. And how exactly we want to do that is debatable. It's not at all clear. I mean, you really then have to just kind of make some population reads, or you can get an idea. You can kind of figure that, okay, probably since this guy is very aggressively opening, he'll be opening a lot of, he will be opening a lot of weak hands if he's opening every hand. And since he's going to have a lot weaker range on average when you decide to 3-bet, you can probably conclude that he's going to be folding an awful lot, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It could be that villain alpha, if all we know is that he's opening 100% of his hands heads up, it could be that if we 3-bet him, he's going to 4-bet us a ton. That's different than if he's going to fold a ton, right? So we definitely know the best way to beat this guy, just given this information, is to hit the fold button less often. And how we do that, whether we choose to just call a ton or 3-bet it, or I'm sorry, 3-bet a ton. It depends on other factors that this does not explain, that just this knowledge here does not give us. So maybe if you don't know anything about your opponent other than he's playing every single hand from the button, he's coming in for a raise 100% of the time, you can just fold a lot less often than you would against somebody playing a more moderately aggressive strategy, like somebody who's opening 75 or 80% of his hands. And you can do that in a balanced way, like just flat call some extra hands, and then you can 3-bet some extra hands for value and balance that out by 3-betting more hands than you normally would for balance in a like bluff or pre-flop semi-bluff type way. But in this case, we know that villain A folds all but the top 10% of his hands to a 3-bet. So since villain A raises too many hands, we should fold less often, and because villain A folds too high a percent when he's facing a 3-bet, we should increase our 3-bet bluff frequency. Because he's folding so much, that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily balance our 3-betting range. It doesn't really say much about what we should do with our value hands, but it does mean that we should definitely be 3-betting as a bluff more often than normal. Whether you want to, if this is all the information you have, is just 1 and 2 here, like he raises 100% and he folds a ton, you still have some decisions to make with regard to what you're going to do if you wake up with pocket aces or kings. I mean, he's folding all the time, so you could say, well, I'm just not going to raise unless I'm bluffing. He's folding 90%, so maybe we don't want to use aces and kings and 3-bet and waste the value by getting tons of folds. Or you could say something like, well, I'm just going to 3-bet the very tip top of my range and then a bunch of bluffs. And that would make a lot of sense, because if you're going to be 3-betting some value hands, you don't want the value hands that you're 3-betting to be worse than the 10% of hands that he actually calls you with, right? So it wouldn't make a lot of sense to take an 11 or 12 or 13th percentile hand and 3-bet it, because then you really are just wasting it. So you could take all of the hands that are going to be a favorite against this 10% range, 3-bet those for value, and then add a ton of bluffs in. And that would be my personal strategy. I think if I just knew nothing but these 2 bits of information, then that's what I would do, is I would take something like the top 5, maybe 4% of all hands, 3-bet those for value, and then a ton of bluffs to go with them. Or you can just flat call all of your big hands or decent hands and 3-bet a bunch of bluffs, just because he's almost always folding, right? He's folding 90% to a 3-bet. So both of those are okay. I think that having some value hands in your 3-bet range is probably going to be good. You can make an argument for either adjustment, but what I would want to caution you against is 3-betting a linear range against this type of player. If he's going to be folding a lot, then we don't want to be wasting perfectly good strong hands just getting him to fold out his garbage. So if we are going to 3-bet for value, and I think it's a good idea to do that, let's make sure that when he does call us, when we're 3-betting our value, that we still are a favorite against his calling range. So we want to have a very tight value range if we are going to 3-bet for value. Now, if we add in that we know villain A never calls, he always 4-bets or folds when facing a 3-bet, now we definitely know this is all information that should lead us towards, yes, folding less, yes, 3-bet bluffing a lot, but definitely polarizing. This is what we need to do. So the way that we capitalize against all of this, we fold less often. We do that by 3-bet bluffing a high percent, and we want to take the tip top of value hands, like the best, maybe 3, 4, 5% of hands, and value 3-bet those. So we want to be super polarized and bluff heavy. That's the best way to combat our opponent, knowing these things about him. So that's how we beat alpha. Now, yeah, if he's playing raise or fold versus a 3-bet, we kind of already went through this. We can simply polarize our 3-bet range against this opponent. We shouldn't be afforded this luxury because we're out of position. We really shouldn't be able to polarize. We don't have the luxury of polarization because we're out of position against his opens, so he should be able to flat call us pretty profitably, meaning that we don't want to have a bunch of bluffs against a guy that is capable of calling us a ton, forcing us to play bloated pots out of position. But because he's playing such an exploitable strategy and he's not readjusting to us, we can do that. We can polarize our range even though we're out of position, which is not normally the best thing to do, but in this case it really can be. We can 3-bet a very bluff-heavy, strict polarized range, like a very sharply polarized range. When villain does 4-bet, we can 5-bet a balanced range, and I think if we do something like, I don't know, 3% value, like we 3-bet the top 3% of hands for value, then some pretty high number of, depending on depth and all kinds of things that we're not going to get into right now, we can 3-bet a tons of bluffs also. And if we're using this very sharply polarized 3-betting range, then if we face a 4-bet, we could just jam whatever percent that we were playing for value, like whatever. And actually, you can think of it that way and use it, that knowledge or kind of that planning ahead in order to construct your 3-bet range. Just say, okay, I'm going to 3-bet all of the hands that I'm planning on 5-betting, and then a bunch of bluffs, and that can just be your sharply polarized range. So when villain does 4-bet, we 5-bet a balanced, we can 5-bet a balanced range, and we can choose to be polarized or linear with the 5-bet range, but I kind of like the idea of using a linear range. We should generally, I think, use a linear range if we're simply folding or raising our entire continuing range, right? Like if we're not deep enough, or just for whatever reason we're not planning on flat calling against his 4-bets, then we may as well just take the top X% of our hands and raise those for value, 5-bet those for value. And I think that it makes a lot of sense to just back up a step and say, well, if that's going to be the game plan moving forward, then I may as well use that to establish what percent of hands I want to be 3-betting for value. So basically, if we know we're going to, let's say stacks are such that if we get 4-bet, we're going to be either folding or jamming. We're just going to be ripping it in. And then just take all of the hands that we want to rip in for value against this player and use those hands to create your 3-betting range. Then balance those out with a bunch of bluffs. And I don't mean that you need to be actually balanced. I just mean balance them out with a lot of bluffs, but skip the middle section against this player. You don't want to have a linear range against this particular opponent, a linear 3-betting range. So let's see how this looks from a GTO iterations form. Okay, so villain A begins with his default strategy, this alpha, villain alpha, and hero starts 3-betting him a lot, and using a lot of bluffs and a strictly, like, sharply polarized 3-betting range. Now, once that happens, let's say that villain alpha begins to 4-bet wide and bluff heavy and starts to flat call a lot of strong hands. Okay, that's going to hurt us really bad, right? So what do? Well, if that's what happens, then our next adjustment, so what we're going to do in our next iteration, is we're going to reduce our bluffing frequency to literally 0, and only 3-bet hands that we want to get it all in with. So if that happens, and villain catches that that's happening, villain figures out that that's what we've done to adjust, then he can just begin to flat call a more value merged range, and then he can 3-bet a polarized distribution, which because he's in position, or I'm sorry, villain begins to flat call a more merged range, and this should say 4-bets, a more polarized distribution. And because he's in position, he really should have the option to polarize. That's kind of one of the advantages to playing in position, is you don't have to, in a equilibrium sense, depending on stacks, as long as there's some depth and you do want to be flat calling some hands and playing in position, because you're going to be in position post-flop, the advantage to that is, one of the pre-flop advantages to knowing that you're going to go post-flop with a positional edge is you have the you have license to polarize where the player that's out of position really shouldn't, unless it's for exploitative reasons. So, villain A begins with his strategy that we've discussed. Then hero just starts 3-betting him to bits and using a lot of bluffs and a sharply polarized 3-betting range. Then villain catches on to that, and villain begins to 4-bet wide and bluff heavy and starts to flat call his stronger hands. At that point, what hero wants to do is reduce his bluffing frequency to 0, just not bluff. Look at what that does. If villain is 4-betting wide and bluff heavy, and he starts to flat call strong hands, then hero all at once decides to stop 3-betting anything but value hands, and he only 3-bets super value hands. Then because villain is 4-betting wide and bluff heavy, he's going to be 4-betting into like the nuts a lot with crap hands. And if he starts to flat call all of his strong hands, then he's never going to get stacks in with an edge. And when we 3-bet and we have like a monster strong range, when he flats us, that's going to be us going to post flop with card advantage. So going through the list here, we get to this point here. Then what can villain do to combat that? Well, he can begin to flat call a merged range and 3-bet a more polarized distribution. Again, that should be 4-bet, I'm sorry. Villain begins to flat call a more merged range and 4-bet a more polar distribution, which is probably something closer to what GTO or Nash Equilibrium would look like for a lot of stack sizes. Okay, so in conclusion, got some homework for you guys. I'd like you to come up with some number of tendencies that are probably not game theoretically optimal for a hypothetical villain. Give him a name. Maybe it's a guy you've played with before. Maybe it's the way you think that you would be seen through the eyes of somebody who is really looking. And I kind of did something like this a few videos, or maybe it was the last video, 2 videos ago I think, where I talked about how you could just, really destroy me the way that my default game is, the way that I start. And understand that I play on Bovada, which is it's an anonymous site. So when I start a match, my opponent definitely doesn't know anything about me. So I can have like a very exploitative and exploitable default game. But I wouldn't take that as a piece of advice if you're not playing on an anonymous site. You really do have to worry about your frequencies and reads that players can get on you and might have on you in history, they might have on you, HUD stats they might have on you before whatever particular game actually starts. So anyway, I digress. Come up with some number of tendencies that you think are probably not perfectly GTO for some hypothetical villain. Come up with this, he's either really whatever, he's really passive or he's really aggressive, but get as specific as you can possibly get. Then try to figure out what the very best exploitative adjustments would be against that villain. Okay, so design a villain, come up with all of his tendencies that you want to work on or think about, and then figure out exactly how to best defeat that particular opponent with his particular weaknesses or leaks or imbalances. Then go one step further and say, okay, how could villain counter adjust against these adjustments? And then you can take it to the next iteration, you can work out the next iteration, and just ask yourself, okay, now what could I do, what could hero do to counter exploit this counter exploitation? And I'm not going to offer any examples of this. I mean, I might, but I'm not. That's not the game plan. That's not what I'm intending here. But I think this little homework assignment by itself, if you've never done this, I think you'll get so much out of it. I think that it's like, as a poker player, especially if you're playing a lot of heads up, this is invaluable. I mean, this, if you've never done it, I would go as far as to say, for a lot of you, it might be the very best way that you could spend your next 3 hours of off-table study time or poker homework. I think that this is just an invaluable resource. It'll help you figure out how to make quicker adjustments on the fly, and it'll also help you to figure out what kind of things you ought to be looking for to try to see if your opponent is moving to counter exploit you. So not only is it going to help you to make rapid adjustments when you're in game, but if you go through this, at least these 3 or 4 iterations, it should also help you to see, like, once you've made an adjustment, what kind of things you should expect to see if your opponent figured out what you're doing and is trying to beat it. Yeah, guys, I hope that didn't sound or feel rushed, and I hope it was worth watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time. Oh, and if you'd like to go through this exercise, we'll call it the equilibration exercise. Do that, send it to me, or post it in the comments. Maybe we can get some discussion going on it. I'll definitely take a look and give you my input. And also, like and subscribe, share with your friends. And if you'd like coaching, I'm definitely taking on students. I do get nothing but positive feedback when I do coaching, and I do it pretty inexpensively. So if you're not a world beater right now, I promise you I can take you from white to yellow belt, or from yellow belt to green belt, and inexpensively. So, and I enjoy doing it. So guys, until next time, good quote LUCK and quote exclamation point over and out. Laters.